Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today we're going to be making block 1 of Supernova. It's the new block of the month designed by me, and it is available in 2 colorways, and it begins in April of 2019. We're releasing this video a little bit early. Normally they're going to come out on the 1st of the month through the end of the year, but we're releasing it a little bit early because signups are still open through the end of March 2019. If you sign up after that, you can still get the book and make it with your own fabrics. You could get the book and then also get a kit to go with it, so you can choose from our hot or our cool colorway. Either one will work for you, but you have to purchase it as an entire kit. If you want to purchase it as a subscription, so that way you only pay $27.50 a month plus shipping, you can do that by signing up on our website at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com before the end of March in 2019. We usually do offer a round 2, so you can always just sign up for our email list and then you'll know when we open up signups for round 2. The other option you can do is see if your local quilt shop is going to be hosting a Supernova block of the month. We're partnering with Clothworks again. We are using their fabric Misty. It's a great basics, is kind of a modeled print where there's these pretty solids that just have this cool texture to them, so you get a nice little dimension as you're working with it, which was the name of our last block of the month. Can't get it out of my head. But it's really fun, and so quilt shops across the country are going to be doing this block of the month as well. So first check with your local quilt shop, and if they're not doing it, you can always support us by ordering from us at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. All right, well, let's get started. I'm really excited about this block of the month because we're going to be tackling all different types of triangles, but we're doing them in large pieces. So that way you're not going to be making tons and tons of teeny tiny little bits. You're going to be making blocks that finish at 18 inches square, and that way you can get the quilt done without having to make dozens and dozens of blocks each month. And we're going to learn how to do all different types of triangle units, always starting from a square, which is my preferred method of doing it because your bias stays a lot more stable when we do it this way, so your points are more likely to end up where they're supposed to when it's all done. For the first month, we're working all with half square triangles, which is a good foundation block to get down. So if you're a little nervous about half square triangles, don't worry, we're going to walk you through it all step by step, so that way when we move on to more complicated triangle piecing later on, you're going to have it down and you're going to have the confidence to do it. Let's get started. So all of the instructions for how much you need to cut and what sizes are available in the book to go along with this. It's called Supernova and available at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, or potentially your local quilt shop might get it as well. But please refer to that because there are full color layout diagrams using the actual fabrics that we use here, so it's really easy to follow along with. But the videos are nice and supplemental, especially if you're a visual learner. It's supposed to help you go through it. So what we're going to do is first we're going to draw a line on the wrong side of our background squares. And I'm going to be alternating in these videos between the hot and the cool colorway. I am starting with the hot colorway here. And so I've got my black background, and then I have my Misty solids. Well, they're not solids. I have my Misty here, and those are going to get paired with these to make half square triangles. So the first thing I need to do is I need to draw a line on the wrong side of my fabric. And for black fabric, I really like to use my Sew Line pencil for that. It's really neat. It's a mechanical pencil, and it has white chalk in the tip. So you just click your eraser like anything else, and the chalk will come out. And then it's really easy to see your markings on your black fabric. For the regular version, for the cool version, any friction gel pen will do. You just don't want to use like an ink pen because that could bleed when you wash it, but a pencil would be fine, a regular pencil on the lighter fabric, or any of these friction gel pens, or anything else that's meant to work with fabric. So all you're going to do, you don't need any special templates or anything to make this. A 6.5 inch ruler or a 12.5 inch ruler will be just fine for you with this. But all you're going to do is you're going to lay it on the wrong side of your fabric. I'm using a solid, so there is no wrong side. But if you were using the light version, just make sure it's the wrong side. And then I lay it so that my ruler's hitting my points there. And then with my pencil leaning in like this, you don't want to have it leaning out or straight up and down, but with it in so that that lead is right up against the side of that ruler, I usually just mark from the center out. And when I mark from the center out, I find the fabric doesn't shift as much on me, whereas if I were to try to go from top all the way to bottom, sometimes things move about a little bit like that, and then you don't get as good a line as you should. But you should have a nice clear line going from tip to tip. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our fabrics and we're going to layer them right sides together like this. And if you've cut everything accurately, these should fit exactly on top of each other. And then we're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam down both sides of this line, and you can chain piece those to make that go really fast. So I'm going to chain piece all the ones for this quilt next. So when you sew a scant 1/4 inch seam, all you're doing is sewing a little bit skinnier seam than a regular 1/4 inch stitch. So to do that on my machine, what I do is I set it up to sew a 1/4 inch stitch, and then I hit one button and my needle is going to move one needle width to the right. So for me, that's a 6.0 stitch setting on this baby lock. Yours may vary a little bit differently depending on how yours is set up. What it does is it gives you just a little bit extra wiggle room so that way when you go to trim this down to the right size later, you are definitely going to have something that ends up being the right size. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just lining up the edge of my presser foot. Instead of lining up with the edge of the fabric like we would if we were sewing a regular seam, I'm just lining up with that line that we drew and pretending that that's the edge of the fabric, because it will be once we cut this apart. So this is a really great opportunity to chain piece and speed up your time working, and then also the amount of thread you use. What you do is you're just going to grab your next pieces and get those all nice and aligned. And I don't really pin at this step. You certainly could if you wanted to, if that made you feel more comfortable. But what you do is you just lift your presser foot up and slide it down so that the point is just sliding right in there. Your sewing machine is going to sew a couple of stitches over nothing, and that's fine. There's no problem with it. And then I just make sure my corners are lined up at the bottom and just keep on sewing. And so that's a really great way to really quickly sew a lot of these. All right, so I just finished sewing my last one together, and I've got all these guys stringed together here. I'm not even going to break thread here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up my presser foot, turn everything around, lift my needle up, and then I'm just going to go down the other side of that drawn line. So I'm just relining it up so that the edge of my presser foot is still in line with that line that we drew, and then I'm just going to keep on sewing. And when I get to the end of that one there, I'm just going to flip it over so that I can see the line on the next one, get that lined up underneath, and let it go. And I'm just going to keep doing that until I've sewn down both sides of the drawn line on my entire chain. So once I've got my whole chain done, now I'm just going to clip these apart. And I use my embroidery scissors for that, so that way I can just snip my threads and put that to the side and do that to prep all these for the next step. So now we're going to cut these apart to get 2 half square triangles. So what you want to do is you just want to line your ruler up point to point, and it needs to be kind of near the line, but not exactly right on the line. So sometimes if things shift a little bit, you've already got your accuracy in there from sewing the scant 1/4 inch away from the line, which we can see a little bit better on this side. So if it's not perfectly on top of the line when you cut, that's fine, but you don't want to get where you have a really skinny seam. Anything that's 1/8 of an inch or less with your seam could pop open with use, or if you have it long armed. So now when we open these up, we have some half square triangles. So I'm going to go ahead and keep cutting the rest of my pile. You do the same. Then I'm going to show you how to press and trim, and then we're ready to put this block together. More and more when I'm making any type of triangle, I prefer to press my seam open. And I find that it gives me a really flat block, a really flat seam. If you've ever had a block where there's just this big hump where all the seams come together, you can reduce and almost eliminate the majority of that if you press your seams open instead. So what I like to do for that is I will just take my block and lay it so that the right side is down, the wrong side's facing up. And then I just open that seam with my fingers, and then holding down that seam with 3 fingers in front of the iron. Just be careful you don't get your fingers with your iron. Just bring that iron along it, keeping the tip right in that seam. You should have a nice straight line, no wiggles. If there are wiggles, then it means there is a pleat on the other side. And then I usually hit the iron from the other side again, just to get that really nice and flat. And I find that this really makes for really flat piecing, and it really opens up your possibilities for what you can do when you go to quilt it as well. So I'm going to go ahead and press the rest of my blocks open, and then we'll go from there. You'll also notice that I use black thread when I piece this. I almost always use white or a light gray thread when I'm piecing, and I do that because it blends with almost anything, and then you don't have to have a million colors of thread. But for this one, because this is so black, sometimes you can see it a little bit from the front when you do your quilting, depending on how densely you quilt and how tight you've got everything basted. So I just like to have black, so that way if you do see the thread at all, you're just seeing it against the fabric that's black, and it sort of blends a little bit better. For the light version, I just use my plain white and gray, and I always use Aurifil 50 weight for my piecing. Now it's time to trim this to size, and the secret to getting points that end up where they're supposed to be is the 45-degree line on your ruler. So what you want to do is line it up so that the 45-degree line is on the seam line, because if that stays on the seam line, then you're always going to have a point that goes right to the corner of your triangle, and you won't lose it when you go to sew it together. So first I'm making sure that I've got that 45-degree line on, and then I want to make sure I've got fabric hanging past the measurement I need to trim this down to on both the outside and then also where the measurement is indicated on the ruler. Then I'm right-handed, so I'm going to trim on the right and the top side. It would be the left and top if you're a lefty. So now I've got everything nice and trimmed. My point goes right to the corner, which is exactly what we want. So now we're going to flip that around, do a 180-degree flip. So now my cut edges are on the left and the bottom side. So now when I line this up, I'm still going to start with that 45-degree line, make sure that is nice and in place. And then I want to make sure that my edges that I just cut are exactly on the measurement that I need to cut to. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim that up again. And now we have a perfect half square triangle. And I know it's really tempting to skip this step, so I'm just going to lay it down next to another one that's not trimmed. So you can see it's smaller, it's the exact size it needs to be, and it's nice and trim, and you have everything going where it should be. So not only is it going to be a lot easier to get everything to go next to each other because it's all going to be the same size, but it's going to be a lot easier to get everything to lay nice and flat because, again, you're starting with the same size and sewing to something that's the exact same size, and you don't have these dog ears anymore, which are going to add bulk. So all of that will help make your block lie nice and flat when we sew it together. So go ahead and finish trimming everything up, and then we're going to sew this together. So I finished trimming everything, and I've laid out my first 2 rows. If you know how to sew the first 2 rows together, you're going to be able to get the rest of the block together just as easily because it's the same steps, just more rows. So I'm going to show you how I sew these rows together, and I make sure I keep everything in line and that we don't lose these points when we sew them together. So I'm just going to sew 1 row together at a time. So I'm going to start with this top row, and I'm just going to flip it right sides together. And at this point, I don't pin because everything should either be a square that you've cut perfectly or a half square triangle that you have trimmed perfectly. So at this point, everything should be the exact same size, so it's not too difficult to sew it all together. I'm using just a regular standard 1/4" seam to sew these together. And I'm going to go ahead and chain piece this block. So what I'm going to do next is go ahead and grab these. Now here's where I will be pinning, and it's any time that we have 2 parts coming together like this. I want to make sure that those top bits are pinned together nicely. So what I do here is I'm going to line it up so that way I can tell that those are right on top of each other, and often you can tell just by looking at it from the top. It should be going straight from one side to another. You also can peel it back a little bit and make sure that your seams are right on top of each other. Once you're happy with that placement, I put a pin in on the right side of the seam allowance. And that's because I'm going to be sewing from the top down. So you're going to hit the left side first. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get this underneath the sewing machine, and we're going to take that needle out pretty quickly here. So I just want to have that in place for just a second. I'm just going to take a couple of stitches forward. It's like 3 or 4 stitches, and I stop with my needle down. That kind of acts like a pin to keep everything in place. So now I'm able to pull this pin out and pull it to the side. If you have a sewing machine foot that has like a flange on the side that prevents your pin from going on there, I would highly suggest investing in a 1/4 inch foot or a foot that doesn't have that, because I find that it's a lot easier to pin accurately and keep your points together if you don't have that extra piece. There are great times when you would want to use that type of foot, but this is just not one of them in my opinion. So now I'm just going to hold my corners together and sew down the rest of that. And we're just going to grab the next bit and sew those together as well. Now, if you wanted to, you could press everything open right now. What I'm going to do is just lay everything back in the place it was supposed to be. This just helps me double check that I've sewn everything together correctly and that I can continue sewing it correctly as I go. All right, so everything is still looking right. So now I'm going to take and sew these guys right sides together. And again, I don't pin unless I have points coming together. That's the only time I'm gonna take time to pin at this point, because everything should be the exact same size if you've carefully trimmed everything to this point. All right, I always lay it back out in between, again, to make sure that everything is looking as it should. So now we're gonna attach the side here. All right, so I've got row 1 together, and normally at this point I would press that, but I'm just gonna go ahead and sew the second row together too, so you guys can see kind of how this will go together when it's pairing a half square triangle to a square, because it's a little different, but again, you don't have to pin for those bits, and then we'll press all at once. So here you can see we have a point on the bottom, but this is just a plain square. So there's nothing that we have to really worry about in terms of making sure that the points come together, because there aren't 2 points to match. So again, for this one, I'm just going to flip it right sides together, line up my corners, and sew without any pins. But again, if you feel more comfortable using pins, by all means, please do. Now for the center, again, we have ones to match. So I'm going to go ahead and lay those right sides together. Then I'm going to match my points and pin. Again here, no points to match, so we can just flip it right sides together, match up our corners, and sew our 1/4 inch seam. All right, so I've got everything laid back out, and again, everything is still going in the direction it's supposed to be, so very good. And now we're going to sew these two together. And even though we have 2 points here, they're not together. So again, we're able to just flip these right sides together and sew as long as we get our corners lined up, because we don't have any points to match at this point. So you can go pretty quickly, and the only one you're going to have to pin on this block is going to be that center seam when you're assembling the rows. There's more to do when we put our rows together, but for now it goes pretty quickly. Double check we're all still looking good. Flip them right sides together and sew this seam, and then we'll press. All right, so just like before, I'm just going to open those seams up with my fingers first and then go down it with the iron. And when you get to the points like this, where you have the corners, you just want to make sure that you're not going to be flipping one of these seams going the other way. So I sometimes will lift the iron up just a little bit as I'm coming to a seam and just kind of plop it down. When I'm all done, I'm going to flip everything over so that the right side is up, and then just kind of wiggle my iron over there. You don't want to go too crazy because you don't want to stretch anything out of place, but you do want to get it nice and flat. And you can see my point is really, really close together. I'm really happy with how that join came out. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other one, and then we'll show you how to assemble your rows. So when you get these sewn together, you'll notice that your points are about 1/4 inch away from the edge of your row, and that's important. That's the way it's supposed to be, because if you think about it, when you sew this together, you're going to use 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if your point came all the way out to the edge or really close to it, when you sew in that 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're going to lose your tip, and then it doesn't look good and you'll be frustrated and it's not good. So ideally, whenever you sew a triangle, the point of it is going to end about 1/4 inch away. Now, it doesn't always end exactly 1/4 inch away, and that's where this 2 pinning technique comes in handy. This is how I pin every single triangle point that has to meet and come together. And you know I hate pinning if you've watched my videos, but I do it every single time because the results are so worth it. So let me show you how this works. So first I'm going to flip these right sides together, and you can see I actually have fewer points to match on this side. So I'm actually going to flip it over, because when I'm sewing, I want to have this side up, because I'm actually going to aim to sew just to the needle side of where these points come together, so that way I don't lose them. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing closer. All right, so here you can see that on one side I've got my nice 45-degree line of my triangle, and underneath that there is a point. So I want to try and match those as perfectly as I can. So to do that, I'm going to take one pin and I'm putting it in right at the tip of where that triangle comes together. So if we look at it from this side, it is coming out at the point of that triangle. Now I'm going to put the needle or pin right through just above the tip of the other triangle that it's going to match up with. So now I'm going to pinch that so that the pin is going straight up and down. And I'm not going to pin with that one. I'm going to pin with the second pin. The reason why, if I were to rotate this to the side and pin it, it's going to shift your top row forward and your bottom row back, and your points are no longer going to be right on top of each other. So while I'm holding that straight up and down, I'm coming in with the second pin and going from the side there. So I still have this one going straight up and down. This one's going from the side. Then I can remove this pin as I'm sewing down. I can sew just to the seam side of where that point is, and I will not lose either of my points, and they'll be fabulous. So for ones like this one, where we don't have a point to match, it's kind of hard to tell in the black, but essentially what I just do here is I just line my seams right on top of each other, and then again still put a pin in the right side of that seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for the rest of my joints, then we're going to sew this together. So I'm just using that regular 1/4 inch seam again. I'm going to sew until my needle is down in that first side of the seam allowance, the left side, and then I'm going to pull my pin out because the needle is kind of acting as a pin at this point to keep everything together. I'm going to go ahead and sew some more, and in this one I've got a triangle to watch out for. So I want to make sure that I'm sewing just to the right side of that. So I'm going to go nice and slow. If I need to adjust in or out so that it's not a perfect 1/4 inch seam, I'm going to do that, because I'd rather have a seam that is off a little bit than lose a point or have it way out in no man's land, because people will notice that. They won't notice a seam that's off by just a smidge. Then I keep doing that, just kind of slow down as I get to those points to make sure I'm sewing one needle width to the right. And only once my seam is, or my needle is down in that first half of that seam allowance, do I pull that pin. All right, so now we have our moment of truth where we kind of open this up and take a peek at how it came together, and I'm very happy. Look at all these points that look very nice together there. This one is a smidge off, but I'm good with it, and same with this one here. It's looking really good. Now, if you had a point that, say, it didn't turn out so great, say you cut this point off, just rip your seam from about 1 inch on either side of it, readjust, and sew one more time, and you will be good to go. There's no need to undo the whole thing. Just work on that part that was an issue, and you will be fine there. Now I'm going to press this open, and then you have all the skills you need to put together your first block. Now on this one, I really am picking on my iron a lot. So once I get done with one part, I will press open the next section with my fingertips, and then hold my iron down a little bit on there. That way I'm not pressing any of these other seams going in the other direction by just sort of going back and forth with the iron. Give it a little press from the front side too, help make it nice and flat. All right, so I'm gonna finish sewing the rest of the rows together. We'll come back and I'll show you this block in both the dark and light colorways, hot and cool. I'm really loving how these blocks are turning out. I almost have, as I'm filming this, the top together for the hot version. I did the cool version a couple months ago, and I'm just finishing this one up before the block of the month officially begins, and I'm just so loving it. So we'll be right back. Go ahead and sew all your rows together too, and practice on getting those perfect points. So I've got everything sewn together. Here is block 1. It is the centerpiece of our quilt for Supernova. This is the hot version because we have really bright colors and a dark background. And we also have a cool version as well. Both of them have one set of colors and like a big plus sign in the center, and then the outside stars have a different set of colors. You can see the entire quilt. We'll put in some images of it here in the video, but you can also see the entire quilt over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. We're going to link in the video to where you can sign up for the block of the month. If you sign up before the end of March 2019, you can be in our subscription club where you get just the fabric you need to make each month's block. And then the last month you get your binding, and the first month you get your book. And that's for $27.50 a month plus shipping. If you sign up after, if you see this video after the end of March, you've got two options. One, you could see if your local quilt shop is going to do the block of the month, so you can do it with them locally, or you can buy the entire kit from us over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com and you can get started. We're also going to have the book available starting in April, and so you can order that separately as well. Thanks so much for following along. I really hope you enjoy our block of the month. This is our 8th one that we've done, and I really like block of the months because it's what has helped Quilt Addicts Anonymous grow from a little blog into what we are today, where we're able to reach you guys all over the world and have a whole fabric store and, you know, have so many lovely experiences with you guys, and then also have our family be able to live our dream. So thanks so much, and I hope you enjoy this year's BOM, and until next week, happy quilting.